I never imagined the worst day of my life would only be the beginning of a mystery that wouldn't make sense until 7 years later. As my father's casket was slowly lowered into the ground, I couldn't stop staring at the path leading through the cemetery. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted back to the entrance. I kept expecting to see him, a tall man in a black overcoat, my brother. But the path stayed empty. I still remember how tightly my mother clutched the handkerchief in her hands. Her knuckles had turned white, but she never said a word. Every now and then she'd glance toward the cemetery gates, as if refusing to give up hope. The rest of us were doing exactly the same thing. The pastor finished his prayer. One by one, people stepped forward and tossed handfuls of dirt onto the casket. David never came. That was the moment our family changed forever. He couldn't even show up to bury his own father. My Aunt Margaret didn't whisper those words. She made sure everyone heard them. The silence that followed was heavier than the funeral itself. People exchanged looks. Some shook their heads. Others quietly admitted they had always believed David would eventually turn his back on the family. I said nothing. I was 34 years old, living in Seattle and working as a school counselor. My job had taught me never to judge people before I understood the whole story. But even I struggled to explain what had happened. Dad's death had been completely unexpected, a massive heart attack. Everything happened so fast, the doctors never had a chance to save him. Just 3 days earlier, we'd been talking on the phone. He joked about his tomato garden, complained that the neighbor kept parking too close to his driveway, and reminded me to visit more often. He sounded perfectly healthy. 72 hours later, I was picking out a casket. The first person I called after leaving the hospital was David. No answer. I left him a voicemail, then another. Then I texted him, again and again. Nothing. At first, none of us panicked. David lived nearly 2,000 miles away in Montana. He worked as a mechanic in a small town and rarely came home after a huge argument with Dad years earlier. Still, he had never disappeared completely. Every Christmas, Mom received a card. Every birthday, flowers arrived at her front door. Sometimes he'd call me late at night just to ask how our parents were doing, even though he refused to speak with them himself. He was stubborn, painfully stubborn, but he wasn't cruel. That's why I kept believing he'd walk into the church at the last minute. He had to. There was simply no way he'd miss Dad's funeral. But 2 days passed. His phone remained off. We called his co-workers, his neighbors, old friends. No one had seen him. One neighbor thought his pickup truck had been sitting outside the house all week. Another claimed he'd seen David leave before sunrise a few days earlier. Nobody knew what was true. Funerals can't wait forever. So we buried our father without his oldest son. After everyone else had left the cemetery, I stayed behind. Fresh dirt covered the grave. The October wind rustled the branches above us. For a moment, I honestly believed my phone would ring, that David would finally explain everything. Instead, my mother walked over and stood beside me. She looked 10 years older than she had a week before. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't have a son anymore. I'd never heard disappointment sound so painful. Grief eventually softens. Disappointment doesn't. The weeks that followed were filled with questions nobody could answer. Where was David? Why hadn't he called? Why hadn't he come? Everyone had their own theory. Aunt Margaret insisted he'd hated Dad so much that he simply didn't care anymore. My cousin thought it had something to do with money. One of Dad's neighbors brought up the old family feud and claimed this was exactly how it had always been destined to end. It's amazing how quickly people build stories when they don't know the truth. Rumors fill empty spaces better than facts ever do. But every time someone criticized my brother, another memory surfaced. Not the quiet, distant man he'd become, the older brother I grew up with. When I was 7, I crashed my bike on a steep hill and scraped both knees so badly I couldn't walk. David carried me all the way home. When kids at school teased me for wearing thick glasses, he marched over to the playground and somehow convinced every one of them to leave me alone. When our golden retriever died, I couldn't stop crying. David sat beside me on the porch until sunrise because he knew I was too afraid to go back inside the house. That was the brother I remembered. Protective, patient, loyal. Something about the story everyone believed simply didn't fit. Yes, he and Dad had stopped speaking. Yes, years of resentment had built a wall between them. But missing his father's funeral? No. Not without a reason. It's what I wanted to believe. About a month after the funeral, Mom and I began cleaning out Dad's house. It felt strangely untouched. Every wrench in the garage was exactly where he'd left it. Every folder in his office was neatly labeled. Every receipt was filed by year. Even his desk looked as if he had simply stepped out for coffee and would return any minute. I opened drawer after drawer. Tax records, old family photographs, warranty papers, birthday cards. Nothing unusual. Until I reached the very bottom drawer. Tucked beneath a stack of old insurance documents was a plain white envelope. No stamp, no address. Just 2 handwritten words across the front. For David. I froze. The envelope looked old, much older than Dad's illness. The seal had never been broken. I carefully picked it up and called for Mom. She stared at it for only a few seconds before turning away. Throw it out. I looked at her in disbelief. It's Dad's letter. It's too late. Maybe we should mail it to David. Her answer came immediately. If he couldn't be bothered to bury his father, he doesn't deserve his father's last words. She walked out of the room before I could respond. I stood there alone, holding the envelope. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. So instead, I slipped it into my bag. At the time, I had no idea that this small, yellowing envelope would one day unravel the lie our entire family had believed for the next 7 years. The envelope stayed in the top drawer of my desk for almost 7 years. Every now and then, while searching for paperwork or cleaning my office, I'd come across it. The paper had yellowed with age, and the corners had softened from being handled so many times. I'd pick it up, turn it over in my hands, and ask myself the same question I'd asked 100 times before. Should I open it? The answer was always the same, no. The letter wasn't meant for me, it belonged to David. Even after everything that had happened, I couldn't bring myself to read words that had been written for someone else. But I couldn't mail it either. There was nowhere to send it. David had vanished. His old phone number had been disconnected years ago. The small house he rented in Montana had been sold. The neighbors remembered seeing him pack his pickup truck one quiet morning before sunrise. They assumed he'd found another job somewhere out of state. No forwarding address, no phone calls, no Christmas cards, nothing. It was as if he'd erased himself from the world. Life moved on, even if our family never really did. Mom stopped saying David's name altogether. At first it seemed intentional. Eventually, it became a habit. If anyone mentioned him during Thanksgiving or Christmas, she'd quietly change the subject before the conversation had a chance to grow uncomfortable. Still, there were little things she couldn't hide. Every Christmas Eve, she'd set the dining table with 1 extra plate, every single year. Then, just before everyone sat down, she'd quietly carry it back to the kitchen without saying a word. She never admitted she was hoping he'd walk through the front door. She didn't have to. Some hopes are impossible to disguise, especially for a mother. As for me, I buried myself in work. Being a school counselor meant spending every day helping teenagers deal with anxiety, grief, broken families, and impossible choices. Ironically, I always seemed to know the right thing to say to strangers. Yet I couldn't make sense of my own family. That thought stayed with me longer than I cared to admit. Whenever I encouraged someone not to judge before hearing the whole story, a part of me wondered if I had failed my own brother. It was a cold October evening when my phone rang. The number wasn't in my contacts. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something told me not to. Emily Anderson? The man's voice was calm but uncertain. Yes. My name is Tom Harris. He hesitated for a moment. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere, but are you David Anderson's sister? The sound of my brother's name caught me completely off guard. I hadn't heard anyone say it out loud in years. Yes, I answered carefully. There was another pause. Then he said the words that made the room seem suddenly smaller. I'm afraid your brother passed away 3 weeks ago. Everything around me went silent. The traffic outside, the television in the next room, even my own breathing. I stared out the window without seeing anything. For 7 years I'd imagined finding David. I'd pictured angry conversations, questions, answers, maybe even forgiveness. I had never imagined learning about his death from a complete stranger. Tom spoke slowly, almost as if he understood every sentence carried weight. David had spent the last several years working at a small auto repair shop outside Billings. According to Tom, he was one of the best mechanics they'd ever hired. Reliable, quiet, always the first one to arrive, always the last one to leave. He rarely talked about himself, never complained, never celebrated birthdays, never invited anyone over. He kept people at arm's length, Tom admitted, but if someone needed help, he was always there. That sounded exactly like my brother. Tom explained that after David died from a sudden heart attack, they had gone through his personal belongings, trying to locate family members. Most of what they found was ordinary: work clothes, old tools, a few books, nothing that explained who he had been before Montana. Then they discovered a worn leather notebook. Inside the front cover was only one name, mine, along with a phone number I'd somehow kept for almost 15 years. That's how Tom found me. I swallowed hard. Did he ever talk about us? Tom thought for a long moment before answering. Not often. That hurt more than I expected. But every once in a while, he continued, I'd catch him looking at an old family photograph. What would he say? Tom looked away. Always the same thing. One day, she'll know the truth. The truth. Those 3 words echoed in my head for the rest of the night. 2 days later, I was on a flight to Montana. The town where David had lived was exactly what I'd imagined. Quiet streets, small diners, pickup trucks parked outside nearly every building. Everyone seemed to know everyone else. Tom met me outside the repair shop. He was in his early 60s, with rough hands and oil stains that looked permanently worked into his skin. He shook my hand firmly. The rumors your family probably believes, he said. They're wrong. I looked at him. You knew? I knew enough to understand he carried something heavy. David's little house sat near the edge of town. Simple, almost empty. There wasn't much furniture. The kitchen had only a few dishes. The bedroom looked more like a place to sleep than a home someone truly lived in. Nothing about it felt permanent. It was as though he'd spent 7 years waiting for permission to leave. Then I noticed something that stopped me cold. Hanging above the fireplace was an old family photograph, the same one we'd taken almost 20 years earlier. Dad was laughing. Mom had her arm around me. David stood beside us, smiling. The frame had been polished. There wasn't a speck of dust on it. The man everyone believed had abandoned his family had kept that photograph in the center of his home every single day. I couldn't stop staring at it. People don't display pictures of families they hate. Tom helped me sort through David's belongings. There wasn't much. A toolbox, receipts, a coffee mug from the repair shop, a stack of novels. Then, inside the top drawer of his dresser, I found something wrapped neatly with a faded blue ribbon. Letters, dozens of them. Every envelope was addressed to my mother. None had ever been mailed. The oldest was dated just 2 weeks after Dad's funeral. The newest had been written less than a month before David died. More than 50 letters, 7 years' worth of words, never sent. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. I opened the very first envelope. I expected an apology, maybe an explanation. Instead, the very first sentence stole the air from my lungs. Mom, I didn't miss Dad's funeral because I didn't love him. I stayed away because he made me promise I would. I read the line again, and then again. No, that couldn't be right. Dad had spent years wishing the family would heal. Why would he ask his own son not to attend his funeral? I turned the page. As I did, something slipped from inside the envelope. A photograph. It showed Dad and David standing together in a hospital room. Both of them were smiling. The date stamped in the corner was only 2 days before Dad died. I felt the blood drain from my face. For 7 long years, our family believed David had abandoned our father. But the photograph proved something none of us had ever imagined. He had been there. He had seen Dad before anyone else. And someone had taken the truth to the grave. I stared at the photograph for what felt like hours. The more I looked at it, the more details I noticed. Dad looked frail. His face was pale, and he'd clearly lost weight. But he was smiling. Not the kind of smile people force for a camera. It was genuine. Relieved. David stood beside him with tired eyes and unshaven cheeks, as though he hadn't slept in days. But he was smiling too. There was no anger between them, no bitterness, no trace of the hatred we'd all believed had separated them for years. Everything our family thought we knew had been wrong. I sat down on the edge of David's bed and reached for the remaining letters. Almost every one of them began the same way. Mom, I almost called today. Emily, I wish I could tell you everything. I made Dad a promise. Over and over again, the promise. Whatever happened in that hospital room had followed my brother for the rest of his life. At the bottom of the stack was one final envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Mom. It was addressed to me. Emily. My hands shook as I unfolded the pages. The handwriting was unmistakably David's. Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. I'm sorry I let you believe I abandoned all of you. I'm sorry I let Mom hate me. I'm sorry I let you carry questions I could never answer. But I kept my word. The night Dad was admitted to the hospital, he asked everyone to leave the room except me. I thought he wanted to make peace. Instead, he asked me for something I never should have agreed to. I stopped reading for a moment. A lump formed in my throat. I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next. He told me something he'd hidden for almost 20 years. He confessed that Sarah's death wasn't simply an accident. The words blurred through my tears. Sarah, my brother's fiancée. She had died in a car crash when we were both still in our 20s. Our family had always believed it was nothing more than terrible weather and bad luck. That was the story we'd lived with for decades. David continued. Dad admitted that Sarah had been driving because of him. He had called her late that night and begged her to deliver important legal documents before morning. She wanted to wait until the storm passed. He insisted she leave immediately. She never made it. I covered my mouth. Suddenly, so many pieces of David's life made sense. Why he'd never married. Why he'd left home. Why he'd become quieter every year. He hadn't simply lost the woman he loved. He'd been carrying the man responsible for her death inside his own family. The letter continued. Dad told me he'd lived with that guilt every single day. He wanted to confess everything after his funeral, but he was terrified your mother wouldn't survive it. The doctors had warned him that another major emotional shock could destroy what little peace she had left. Then he asked me for one last favor. I already knew what was coming, even before I reached the next sentence. He asked me not to come to his funeral. He wanted everyone to blame me instead of asking questions. He believed that if the family turned their anger toward me, no one would dig deeper into the past. I refused. We argued for almost an hour. Then, for the first time in my life, I saw Dad cry. He begged me, and I gave him my word. I lowered the letter into my lap. For years, we'd called David selfish, heartless, ungrateful. The truth was almost unbearable. He had sacrificed his own place in the family to protect the last wish of a dying man. Whether that wish was right or wrong no longer mattered. He'd kept it, completely, silently, until the day he died. Inside the envelope was something else, a second letter. This one was written in my father's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. It was the same sealed envelope that had been sitting in my desk drawer for 7 years, the one marked for David. With trembling fingers, I opened it. My dear family, if you're reading this, then David could no longer carry my burden alone. That burden belongs to me, not to him. I spent 20 years pretending one terrible decision hadn't changed all of our lives. It did. Every birthday David celebrated without Sarah, every Christmas he spent alone, every year our family drifted farther apart. It all began with my mistake. When the doctors told me I was dying, I wanted to tell all of you the truth. But I was a coward. I couldn't bear the thought of your mother living her final years believing she'd shared her life with a man responsible for another person's death. So I asked our son to protect her. He deserved a better father than I was. If you can forgive anyone, forgive him first. By the time I finished reading, tears were falling freely onto the paper. For years I'd searched for someone to blame. Now I realized there had never been a villain, only broken people making impossible choices. Dad wasn't the perfect man I'd believed him to be. David wasn't the monster our family had imagined. Mom wasn't cruel. She was simply grieving a son she thought had abandoned her. We had all been mourning different versions of the same story. A week later, I returned home. Mom was sitting on the back porch when I arrived. She looked up before I said a word. "I found him," I whispered. She nodded. "I know." I handed her both letters. She read them slowly. Sometimes she stopped to wipe away tears. Sometimes she closed her eyes for several minutes before continuing. When she reached the end, she didn't speak. Instead, she stood up, walked into the house, and disappeared down the hallway. A few moments later, she came back carrying an old photo album. She opened it to a picture of David as a little boy. Then she gently rested her hand on the photograph. "I spent 7 years believing my son stopped loving us," she said quietly. "The whole time, he was loving us more than I ever understood." A month later, we traveled to Montana. David had asked to have his ashes scattered in the mountains he'd grown to love. Before we left, we placed a small memorial stone beside Dad's grave back in Seattle. Not because David was buried there, but because he finally deserved a place in the family he'd never stopped carrying in his heart. The inscription was simple: "Beloved son, faithful to his promise." People sometimes ask whether I wish we'd learned the truth sooner. Of course I do. I'd give anything for one more conversation with my brother, one chance to tell him that, despite everything, a part of me never stopped believing there had to be a reason. Life rarely gives us the answers when we want them. Sometimes they arrive years too late, and by then, the people who deserve to hear, "I'm sorry," are already gone. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's this: never mistake silence for indifference. The heaviest burdens are often carried by the people who complain the least, and sometimes the person everyone condemns is the one who loved the deepest.